Can you actually create a professional sounding master just using Ableton Live with its stock tools? No external plugins allowed. That's the question that I'm going to answer in this video. Alright, so here's the backstory on how this video idea came about. In my last tutorial, I was mastering a track start to finish. It was a melodic techno track called Leaving by an artist called Paul Conrad. And I was working with external plugins, but using Ableton Live. I typically master music in Wavelab, which is a specialized mastering DAW. But for you to be able to follow a bit more easily, I did the same thing basically inside Ableton Live. I started to ask myself, is it possible to get close to this result just using the stock tools inside Ableton Live 12? Now, I'm honestly a little bit scared, and I do professional mastering since many years. I've been in the music industry since almost 2 decades. I run a professional studio in Berlin. I do this full time, and I'm used to my tools. So it's like a good craftsman basically does not rely on tools necessarily. But on the other hand, there is something to be said about like working in flow state with the tools that you know inside and out. You exactly have your settings. You know how they will react to different materials. And now just pulling all of that aside and saying I'm going to master a song just using the Ableton Live stock devices. Theoretically, I think it's possible to get close to the other result, but still, I mean, there is something scary about this. Okay, for you to understand the session, on top we have the master that we created in the last tutorial, and this still has the chain activated that we've been using. The mastered track sounds like this. And the green thing here on the bottom is the unmastered version. So I basically duplicated it. Everything is the same, but the plugins are all thrown away. And this is where we will be working with just Ableton stock devices. All right, the same process applies as in the other tutorial. So if you have questions about the workflow itself, I highly recommend you watch that other video because I in-depth talk about every single step. In the other video, we did the metric AB plugin first, so referencing plugin. In this case, I don't use that because we're referencing against the master that we have on top here. So I will start with the second step, which is the limiter. So instead of the FabFilter Pro L2, we're going to use the limiter by Ableton. This is the last thing in the chain before a potential referencing plugin. So let's just see how far we can push this without sounding super squashed. Ceiling will put to -0.1. The release time, I don't like the auto release. Make this a bit shorter, so around 7 milliseconds. So this is close enough in terms of loudness. The limiter is doing a little bit of work here. I must say I don't really like the Ableton limiter. It's a good tool to use just quickly on individual mix elements. I don't like it as much on a master bus. It doesn't sound as clean to me, but still, I mean, it's workable. It works fine. I think with a mix or a production that is in good shape overall, which this one here is, I think it's definitely usable. Still, like overall, the sound is way too boomy, in my opinion, for the final master. Like even comparing it, flipping back and forth, you can hear it. It's now unmastered and then the mastered one. So a little bit too much low mids, definitely too boomy in that region to be played on big festival systems, but still we want to preserve that warmth, that lush feeling of the master. Now, we'll bring in the first plugin, in this case the filter, yeah, so the auto filter should do actually, and we'll go the high pass filter. Once again, the reason why I'm using a high pass filter, refer to this in the other video. Don't always do this. In some cases it makes sense, in some it doesn't. Now, one of the problems that I see very often with filters being used, especially in Ableton, because you don't see everything as precise, it's just like these small menus, and yes, you can sometimes open up a panel. The issue that I very often see is that people just filter out way too aggressively, so around like 100 Hz or something. Sometimes I get pre-masters that sound like this, where essentially the 2 octaves are missing. already this is not sounding as convincing as the infrasonic filter that I've been using in the original master. So I'll actually take this away. And this is really important. I mean, you have to trust your critical listening abilities, and that is something you train. But with the original master, I actually used the infrasonic filter. I can pull it up here again. And the infrasonic filter was like a relatively similar curve that I dialed in right now, but it made the low end overall a tiny bit more punchy. It was really hard to perceive, like very, very subtle. But with the Ableton filter, for whatever reason, it doesn't sound as good. So what I'm going to do here is I will use the EQ and we will use a low shelf, and we'll see if we can mimic a similar curve. Quite there, but it's close, and here I definitely hear like a positive difference, so I'll leave this on. But already I feel it's quite a challenge, to be honest. Yeah, next up we would use a clipper plugin. So what I've been using in the original master is the K-Clip 3, and in this case actually I like the Ableton Saturator plugin quite a lot. The Ableton Saturator has a few different modes, and the question is like, which mode do you actually use for what I'm doing here? On the K-Clip 3, one of my favorite settings is this crisp mode. The crisp mode models analog to digital converter, really famous one. I think it's the Lavery Blue. This has a very distinct sound when hard clipping. And what you need to do here is you have to go into a digital clip basically, because that's essentially the hard clip function. Hard curve is also quite close, but I would definitely go into the digital clip. It's the closest that you can get. And we'll have to kind of adjust the drive to sit in the sweet spot. I hope that it sounds good. If it doesn't, we'll just leave it out. So once again, to me, it sounds just a bit too saturated. I actually won't use this. Like the normal clipping function that I get from the K-Clip 3 cannot really be mimicked in the same way. It's also really hard because you don't really see what it's reacting to. You just hear that at some point it starts distorting, but it's really hard to fine tune it to sit exactly where you want it to sit. I do have probably another idea for later on, but we can try out, but I won't do it in this point in the chain. So what we will do now is we will go into a little bit of compression, and this is where I'm a bit more relaxed, to be honest. Now, the reason I'm more relaxed about compression here is because Ableton has the glue compressor, which is a great compressor for bus compressing or mastering compression even. It's not really the same thing as the tools that I use in the other original master, but it's definitely something where I have confidence that I can get it to sound really, really good. So we'll go for 30 milliseconds attack time to just let a lot of the transient material through, and we'll go to the fastest release time setting, and the ratio will keep at 2:1. Now, typically in mastering, I rarely go to 2:1. I mainly stay below that, so 1.5:1, 1.8:1, sometimes 1.2:1 in many situations. But this is just the lowest setting that we have here, and so we'll just see. Touching the needle a tiny bit here, so it's really, really subtle. If you got any value out of this video so far, consider subscribing to the channel, consider liking this video. It really helps me make these kinds of videos for you, but it also helps you because YouTube will suggest much better content in your feed. Now, if I have to be really fair in terms of comparison, I typically leave out a lot of the low end for the compression. It's not multi-band compression, but the sidechain signal of the compressor, the signal that the compressor listens to, which I've explained in another video really in depth. So we can leave out some of the lower end of the detection circuit, which means the ballistics of the compressor will be more fine-tuned towards what's happening in the top end. But it still compresses the whole signal, so don't misunderstand this, please. So we will now filter out some of the low end. I already hear some more distortion than I actually want, and that is for sure coming because the limiter is working a bit too hard. So we already have to bring the level, like the gain in the limiter, down a bit. By the way, if you don't hear these changes, this is just some of the critical listening that just still needs to happen. Your ears will develop over time to hear these things a bit more pronounced, but still it's like subtle stuff that we're doing here. It's not anything super crazy. Now we'll go into a little bit of EQing because that is the elephant in the room. With EQs, you have the biggest leverage in mastering. If you shape the tone accordingly, that is your biggest point of leverage. It's much more important than compression. We'll go to the EQ8 after the compressor now. And so we'll try to come closer to the curve that I've dialed in the other master. So just to refresh ourselves, we've been using the Kirchhoff EQ. Now I will not try to match the exact settings of this here. I will just listen and get to a good sound basically. But this is, for those of you who need a bit of references, basically what we did in the other EQ. So let's see what sounds good on this one. And by the way, some EQs use different definitions of Q factor, for example. So you can never rely on the Q factor, for example, being the same in one EQ versus the other. Many of them are standardized, but not all of them. The FabFilter Pro Q3, for example, has a different Q definition than the Kirchhoff EQ does, which is very weird and confusing, but this is why I just need to do what sounds great, period. So what do we want to do? That's maybe something I want to talk about quickly. So I want the kick to come out a tiny bit more, so a bit more of a club feel to the track. I want to open up the top end a tiny bit and maybe get a little bit out of that low mid-range, because to me it sounds a bit too packed in there. It's leaning a bit too heavily on this like low mid-range. With the EQ8 is pretty fiddly. In here, I would always kind of bring up that spectrum here. That is a bit easier to work in. To compensate for the gain a little bit, so I'll bring this down a bit. So this is how really subtle EQ moves do a lot of the heavy lifting. Now this is already a bit too much, I feel. This can be a tiny bit more actually. that definitely works for me. I have the feeling that I want to reduce a bit more here in the mid still, but maybe it's not done with one cut. So we'll have to see what we'll do about this, or maybe we just swap this over. Definitely longer than I expected to EQ this, simply because I'm using a different tool. I don't work that much with the EQ8. I find it a bit fiddly. The Kirchhoff and the Pep filter to me are a bit more accessible, intuitive. I don't think that this necessarily sounds any worse. It's just a way of working. Yeah, I find the other tools a bit more comfortable. And yes, maybe there is like a tiny difference. But to be honest, they are all clean EQs. So scientifically, they should null if you dial in the exact same curves if they're programmed well, which I assume that they are. And so stock EQs for clean things that you want to do is definitely good enough. You just have to get used to this. And if you're not doing professional mastering, not doing professional mixing, and you get used to using the EQ8 a lot, I think it's perfectly fine to use it. So what's still missing right now is the saturation. We used the Oven, really cool saturation plugin. It's quite complex, the routing and the different functions. But we used a little bit of that sizzle function especially to bring out a tiny bit of life and a bit more character into the percussions in the top end. Now, I'm really curious if we can get to a similar result inside Ableton Live, but the cool thing is that Ableton Live 12 has Roar, which is a really nice saturation plugin. And the way we can maybe mimic this is we can use the multiband saturation inside Roar. We have put this in multiband mode. You see, we have the lows, we have the mids, and we have the highs. So all of these are essentially also active in the Oven plugin, but we're essentially pushing more into the highs. We'll do the same thing here. We'll deactivate some of these like settings that we don't need. We also deactivate the filters here. They don't really make sense for our settings. We'll stay in soft clipping mode because that's more forgiving overall. Now let's focus on the highs here. Run the signal into Roar, and then we'll basically adjust the amount of soft clipping in the top end, and we'll see how that sounds. You can tell it's already getting quite intense. I have to dial this down quite a bit. I'm actually pleasantly surprised by the sound. It's a bit more extreme than something like the Oven, so it could definitely be more subtle in my opinion. But this is where we can maybe try out the wet-dry setting. With the Oven plugin, I actually didn't need to put into wet-dry mode. It was just already a bit more subtle, or a bit easier to dial in a subtle setting. So what we can do here is we can essentially feed this into wet-dry a bit, and then we can maybe see, push the highs even more, but reduce the wet-dry a bit. Mind, like this is still subtle distortion, so there's very little shaping happening. We could deactivate the shapers in the lows and the mids. That's also an option, so we just basically get rid of them completely. So obviously we're now getting into gain staging issues a little bit, so I want this to be more or less the same level. It's a bit too extreme still, the effect. Now we're getting there. It's around 2.4. I would actually like a little bit of that mid still in here. So this is really nice. We actually kept the lows quite clean. We didn't run them into the wave shaping. We used a little bit of the soft clipping in the mids and a bit more of that in the highs. And that actually sounds quite good in my opinion. I have no idea where we are level-wise overall now, but let's A/B this against the master that we've created last time. So that is going to be the really interesting comparison. We'll listen to first of all our current master that we're working on, and then I'll flip over to the other master. Interesting. There's still like a significant difference between the other master and this one. I don't think that our second one necessarily sounds bad, so this is actually still in better shape than a lot of release music out there. I think we could come a little bit closer. We just need to dial in a bit more clarity essentially. So I think our master just sounds a bit too muddy overall. That's probably because the distortion is still a bit too much. Something we cannot do anything about is what the limiter is doing. So this is definitely introducing a little bit of artifacts that I personally don't want. So what we can do is we can bring the wet dry down a little bit here. And also here, I'm thinking about still deactivating shape and the mids. Even though I kind of liked it, I think it's adding to this overall feeling of being a tiny bit too crowded in the low mids. Now we're essentially over that threshold. We're a little bit too, I would say like a little bit too bright here in this one. Really hard to dial this in perfectly. What I would do now is I would actually bring these down a tiny bit. So I'm not getting any harshness. Bring these up a bit so we have more of those mids, but overall less distorted. And then we'll see how far we can push the limiter to get closer. Getting kind of in the ballpark of the other master, but I still think there is a lot more just stability in the other master. Now, I'm not saying this is because the quality of the external plugins is so much better. It probably just has to do with me being able to dial in the settings a bit better in the tools that I'm used to. But overall, in terms of like, would this be releasable, the Ableton Master? I would definitely think so. And overall, this is probably the biggest takeaway for you. I'm still convinced that 80% of the sonic result comes from the production, the composition, the arrangement, and a little bit of the mixing also, of course. And the mastering is kind of the icing on the cake. So I think mixing and mastering together on a really good production make up maybe a 20% enhancement still, which is great. But that tells you that whatever you can do in terms of mastering, you can still do a lot in the tools you already have, but focus your effort more on what's happening in the production. This is a really good song, and Paul has been a member of our coaching program for many months now. He's been releasing music consistently. He really went from 0 releases to actually now this is his 11th track, I think. And he's just crushing it. He's getting tens of thousands of streams and it's fantastically working. He's already playing getting his first gigs, getting booked more, gets endorsement by brands. It's just amazing for an artist that's just starting out. So if you put in the work and if you maybe even have a little bit of accountability and feedback, then you can get there and you can get to really great results with just the tools that you already have. Now, if you want to finish and release music consistently, just like Paul did, then go to pickyourself.com/coaching. You might be a good candidate for our coaching program. It is true one-on-one support over many sessions. We work with you on a consistent basis. We have a community of like-minded artists that supports each other. It's a really uplifting community. I would like to welcome you in our circles. Leave an application at pickyourself.com/coaching. I personally go through every candidate. I personally schedule calls to figure out whether you're a good fit, and then we'll hopefully welcome you in our circle.